Okay, it's time to begin. We are in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. Let me run through our prayer list, and it is a very lengthy prayer list. So most of it is in the bulletin, but I want to make sure I give you all the updates and additions. And then Gene Barnes will lead us in prayer, and then we'll be in Acts chapter 7. If you have your bulletin, you do have most of these. Bailey Owen, who's the friend of Tristan's that was in a very bad automobile accident recently, they're trying to get her in a position where they can take her off of the ventilator, and she's got a very lengthy recovery, though. Michael Swagger is recovering from back surgery. Sue Evans recovering from ankle replacement. Gisela Santoro's dad, Mario, is recovering from surgery in Peru. Nelda Swagger and Vicky Wallbauer are both dealing with some pretty significant health issues. Vinny Rubio is going through chemo treatments. Jim Winkle, I did not ask you this morning. How did you got your test results back? So this week? Okay, so he's still waiting through test results. He hopefully get this week. He has another test this week? Didn't he already pass that one? Okay. Okay, so he does have a stress test this week. Okay. Nick Freeze will have colon surgery on Tuesday and chemo following that. Austin Petty had his scans recently, and the tumors did not respond to the second chemo treatment, so they're doing some adjustments to see if they can correct that issue. Diane Haining is on hospice. David Urbelli, that's Marty Viverka's brother-in-law, is dealing with cancer diagnosis. Chris Cates, that is, if you remember Rod and Deb Dottie, that's their son-in-law, dealing with significant spread of his cancer. Brenda Rash's cousin Cindy, dealing with cancer. Rita Battle's sister Laura, she did get to go home from the hospital yesterday, but she is still being monitored, and Rita is still there, so certainly continue to remember Laura. Marion Hartman is dealing with recovery from a broken knee. Dottie Trahan's brother Joey is on hospice. Sandra Preston, that's Cheryl Barnes' cousin, dealing with radiation treatments for the next 2 weeks. Is that correct? And then Cheryl will have a procedure on August 1st. In addition to that, we had our group return from camp yesterday with COVID. So Rich's cabin had 7 kids go home with COVID. Rich came home with COVID. I think this is his 3rd trip through that COVID universe. But anyway, he's at home quarantining. He is symptomatic, but not terrible, or at least it wasn't yesterday. Cooper LeConte came home with COVID, and so the LeContes are quarantining as well. And we don't know how far that will be before everybody's out of quarantine. So certainly keep all of them in your prayers as they deal with that. Anything else? Yes. But they still haven't removed the ventilator, right? Yeah. Yep. That's yep. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, Gene will lead us in prayer, and then we'll get started.
Heavenly Father, we are indeed thankful, so thankful for all our many blessings. We're mindful of the sick and those that are going through procedures. Let us keep those people in our minds constantly as brothers and sisters and friends of ours. Is what you expect us to do. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to live in this area, the beauty, and we're just mindful of all our many blessings. This morning, as we study your word, give us the ability to apply it to our lives, and that we may live in such a way that when you are finished with us here on earth, that we may live with you eternally. And Heavenly Father, we know that we fall short of thy expectations. Help us, forgive us, and let us live in accordance with thy will. For it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Okay, Acts chapter 7. You know where we are chronologically in our study. You know that the church has seen tremendous growth after the day of Pentecost. They really, I mean, at least is the way we have it recorded. They're only preaching one sermon. There's numerous versions of that one sermon. Now, I do believe they're preaching other things, but based on what's recorded, they just keep repeating this same message that because they're preaching to Jews and they're saying, you crucified the Messiah and God raised him up. And that proved that he was the Messiah too. And so the common people are really starting to listen. And we've also heard that there are some that are not of the common people. Some of the higher people have started to listen. And that's caused even more turmoil among the leadership of the Jews. And so we've seen multiple occasions already where the apostles have been arrested and imprisoned and beaten and things like that. And yet they just keep on going through the same messages. Now, there was a turn in the focus over the last couple of classes from those external attacks to some problems internally. And we dealt with Ananias and Sapphira, who took their land and sold it, and then they gave some money to the apostles so that they could use it to help those who were in need, but they lied about it. You know, they kept part of it back, which was nothing wrong with that. But they lied about it and said they gave all of it, and so God enacted punishment on both of them, and the reasoning on why it was so severe when they were not the only people in there who would be sinful, right? I mean, was anybody else, everybody else there was perfect, right? No, they weren't. So what was it about this that brought about such a great immediate judgment? And the point that's being made is, internal problems destroy the church. Externals, never going to do it. God's already told us that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against his kingdom. The externals, never going to do it. But internal problems, internal error, internal bickering and fighting, well, that'll do it. And so when this first starts, God sets a precedent and a standard even and shows them. And of course, people rightly became afraid at that point, right? So then the next thing we read was another internal problem, and that is, these Jews that had been converted on Pentecost, and even the ones that had followed, they weren't all from Jerusalem, right? The answer is no, they were not. They were from all the nations, right? They had been there on Pentecost from all these nations, and many of them had stayed. And we even read about one, Barnabas, he was a Jew, but he was not from Jerusalem. And so, there started to be a little bit of conflict there, especially as it related to helping take care of the widows. And I would also point out, we have record. I don't know that that's happening at this point yet, but we do have record that one of the things that the early church did is the widows who were being helped to be taken care of by the church actually were taking care of orphans. They were keeping orphans in their care. And so it was kind of a double help in this situation. But the problem is, that's a lot of work, and so some people were getting neglected. And it seemed to be the case that those that were being neglected were the ones from outside of Israel, the Jews that came from other places. And so the apostles said, we have an immense responsibility, and that is to teach and study and pray. And if we take our focus off of that and focus on all these other tasks that other people can do, then who's going to do all this? And so they asked the Christians in Jerusalem to select 7 men. And they gave a, here's a pattern to do this. Here's what you need to be looking for. And they picked those 7 men and they laid hands on them. And these men served in a role, whether they actually were ever called that or not, I don't know. But they're serving in a role like a deacon. And then all of a sudden, again, the same thing happens as every case, and that is the church grew again because they fixed the problem that they were having. That brings us to Acts chapter 7. One of the men that we were introduced to in chapter 6 as those that were chosen to serve in this kind of position as deacons was called Stephen. And Stephen is not only serving and helping in the roles that taking care of the widows and all of that, Stephen's also teaching and preaching. And very quickly that brings about opposition, and so he ends up in a public forum, and they're bringing false witnesses against him, and they're lying about him, and he's in great danger. Chapter 7 is the sermon that he delivers. It's going to be an easy read, a lot of verses in it, a lot of territory to cover, but it's an easy read because we've gone through this chronology of what he's going to give. This is just a history of God's dealing with man. But I want to point something out before we start reading it to help you contextually understand the point that he's making. One of the problems that the first century Jews had with Jesus was that he didn't have the right pedigree. Now, as it related to prophecy, well, the Messiah was supposed to come through the lineage of David, so he had that, didn't he? Yeah, but that's not all there was to their mindset. You know, the priesthood didn't come through, well, you tell me, what tribe did Jesus come from? Judah. Well, how could he be claiming that he could be a priest and Messiah be a priest if he came through Judah? Not be from Levi. How's that possible? Which means, when was Melchizedek? Who was Melchizedek? That's what the Hebrews writer says. Don's got that. But who was Melchizedek connected to in the account? Does anybody know? Who? Abraham. Was Abraham before the law or under the law? He was before the law. So Melchizedek was a priest, but it wasn't according to the law, right? And the Messiah was going to be like that, a priest, but not according to the law, which meant he could be a priest even though he didn't come from the tribe of Levi, right? Okay, but they struggled with things like that. And so the point that Stephen's going to make here is the same one that Stephen's going to make here, the same point that Peter's been making, which is you killed Jesus, but he's going to go through their history and say, look what God did with our ancestors way before the law ever came into position. Look what we did. Look what happened when the law came into existence, and look what we did, and look what's happening now, and look what we did. So that's his point. You might call this sermon, Look What We Did, if you were to write it. Maybe I'll write that one day. But anyway, let's read through it, and we'll read in chunks, I think, today, and I'll just break down wherever I choose to stop and talk. Acts chapter 7. So again, Stephen's standing trial here, or being challenged publicly. And then the high priest said, are these things so? Well, these things are the accusations that it's been made about him, which we've already been told were lies. Now, undoubtedly, he said some of these things, but not in the way they're making them come out. Okay? And he said, here's the sermon. Men and brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. Interesting thing about this sermon is they know everything that he's going to say. They know their history. They consider themselves the children of Abraham, don't they? Yeah. And so as he starts, he said, we all know how this began. We all know how this relationship between God and man and us from our ancestors began, and that is Abraham. And he was in Mesopotamia, and God didn't want him there, and so God told him to leave everything behind. Leave all your family behind, and by the way, he obviously has his wife that goes with him, and Lot's with him. There are some others, but he's talking about this ancestral idolatry that existed in this nation, or in this group of people. And he says, you got to get out of that. And I'm going to take you to a place, and I'm going to show you a place that ultimately, well, let's read it before I say that. Verse 4, then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. So the promise, and we all know this, and they knew it too. God said to Abraham, you got to get out of this area of the Chaldeans, that was later, the Chaldeans, but out of this area of Mesopotamia, you got to go to this land, and I'm going to show you this land, and this land is going to be a land of inheritance. That's his promise. And the problem is, Abraham doesn't have an heir, right? So God made a promise to Abraham's descendants to possess a land that Abraham would never possess. How much of Israel did Abraham ever possess? That's a trick question. The text says, no, not even a place to put his foot, but there actually was a burial. There was a place where people were buried. So there was a tomb that he possessed, but nowhere to live. And yet God told him to go. And why did he go? What do we call Abraham? The father of the faithful, right? Why? Because he was faithful. When God said, get up and go, whether he understood it or not, he got up and he went. He got up and he went, and God said, I'm going to show you something, a land. You're never going to own any of it, but your descendants are going to own it. And Abraham's got no descendants. Did they know this? The people that are listening to Stephen's sermon, did they know all this? Okay, keep reading. Let's see how it fits into place. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would sojourn in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Stop there just a second. Now, that's the second time he said this place. Where are they? Where is Stephen giving this sermon? Yeah, he's at least in Israel, most likely in Jerusalem, right? That's where the leaders of the Jews are. So he's given this sermon in Israel, and twice now he said, this land. He said, God told Abraham to look at this land. I'll show you this land that your descendants will inherit. That's why we're here, he said. But the reason Abraham's not going to get it is because Abraham's not going to live long enough. He's not going to possess it. So God was very open and said, I'm going to show it to you, but then I'm going to send your descendants down somewhere else. And when I send them there, they're going to be blessed, but they're also going to be oppressed. And I want to point out, I'm not going to get into depth with this, but Stephen's sermon has some differences than when you read through the Old Testament account, like the number of years that they were there. And you can say the reason it's different is because he's rounding off numbers, and maybe he is, or maybe he's dating it from a different beginning. If you take it from when Abraham left his home, or if you take it when Jacob's people go down there, which we'll read in just a minute, those are different numbers, and yet they're still accurate because you're looking at it from a different perspective. So whatever it is, they're down there about 400 years, aren't they? Where? In Egypt. Do these people here in Stephen's sermon know that? Okay, keep reading. By the way, that was the prophecy there in verse 7. Verse 8, then he gave them the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot 12 patriarchs. Uh-oh. Now this is an area where it's easy just to read over it and think, well, that's not significant, but it is significant. Who did God give the covenant of circumcision to? With the text, read it. What did it say? Who? Abraham. Did Abraham ever live under the law? So was circumcision brought about because of the law? It was before the law. He's still talking about what God did before the law, what God was doing, how he was putting all of this into place, everything that was happening in God's dealing with man, and he's still talking about how man responded. So Abraham, leave your homeland. Abraham leaves, doesn't he? Abraham, I'm going to show you a land, and you're going to move around in it, and you're going to see it, because I'm going to give it to your descendants, even though right now you don't have any descendants. Did Abraham do it? Yes, he did. Abraham, I'm going to send your descendants down into Egypt, but ultimately I'm going to bring them back. And to put this covenant into place, I want you to practice the act of circumcision. Did he do it? He circumcised his son, who circumcised his son, who circumcised 12 patriarchs, is what it said, isn't it? Who are they? They are, but who are they to the recipients of this sermon? They're their fathers. If you were a priest, what tribe did you come from? Why was it called Levi? Because that was the patriarch from which this line started. One of the 12 patriarchs here, who were part of the circumcision before the law. All right, what if you had been from the land of Judah or the tribe of Judah? Where'd that connect back to? Judah, one of the 12 patriarchs, Judah, before the law, right? If Simeon, Reuben, the rest of them all the same? Okay. Did they do what God told them to do when God said circumcise? Passed it down, didn't they? Verse 9. Things changed. The patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now, notice, and if you remember this when we were studying through the book of Genesis a long time ago in the beginning of this study, chronologically, we got to that place where Joseph was favored by his father, right? His brothers became jealous. There was the account where they decided to kill him, and then they figured out that probably wasn't going to work, so they sold him into slavery. And it was like all that had happened up to that point in the text, we were following Abraham. We worked it down to Isaac, and we worked it down to Jacob. Then all of a sudden with the 12, does the focus of the text stay in Canaan with the 12, 11 of the 12, or does it shift to Egypt? It's just Joseph now. Joseph sold into slavery, and yet the whole focus of the record of what God was doing shifts from what was happening back here in Canaan to just Joseph in Egypt. See, it looks like he's alone. It looks like he's been cast off and sold off by his brothers, but God went with him, right? Under the law? No. There is no law yet. There's no law of Moses yet. Not when Joseph is in Egypt. So he's down there in Egypt, and God is taking care of him. So what comes next? Well, verse 11. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers, that's those patriarchs, right, that are back in Canaan, found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. And then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. Now we'll stop there, and that was a summary of a big section of the text in the Old Testament. I mean, we go from all that happens to Joseph with his being sold by his brothers, being in Potiphar's house, being lied about by falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, being in the prison, interpreting the dreams of the baker and the butler in the prison, being forgotten about in the prison, to the place to where he gets out and interprets the dreams of Pharaoh about this famine that's going to have 7 years of plenty before it happens, but 7 years of feast, or rather famine, after those 7 years of plenty. And so he gave them a plan, and God had used Joseph at this point, and Pharaoh exalted him, didn't he? He became second in command. He saved everybody. In the meantime, what happens is, well, his father, who doesn't even know he's alive, is starving in Canaan. All the family's starving in Canaan. So they end up down there, and the text covered both events right there. We just read it. Both events where they came down. The first time, they didn't know who Joseph was, but they did the second time, didn't they? And they were afraid, weren't they? And that's when Joseph said, "You meant evil to me, but God used it for good, to save many people alive." And so they all moved down to Egypt. And herein, again, we have a textual issue because he uses the number 75, yet that was not the number that was used in the Old Testament when they went down. And again, it's easily worked out in the sense of there are different counts from the perspective of who they're counting. They can be including wives in some of one of the records. They can be not including Joseph and his wife and his sons who are already down there in Egypt. But the point is, it's a number. They're just a very small number, and they're not under the law, are they? And God's taking care of them, isn't He? Hang on a second. Got to make sure I'm not going to sneeze. Okay, let's keep reading. So Jacob went down to 15. Let's start there again. Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. So again, Jacob goes down there, but he doesn't live to go back home. Who's the promise first made to? Abraham. Did he inherit the land? No. Who's his son? Isaac. Did he inherit the land? No. Who's his son? Jacob, where did he die? Egypt. Did he inherit the land? No. This was generations, wasn't it? And they were not under the law. That's what his emphasis is. They're not under the law. So he says God kept on using them, even though at this point the brothers had already turned away and sold their brother Joseph into Egypt. But God's still with them. He's still pulling them along. They did come back and bury Abraham, or rather, bury Jacob. But verse 17. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So again, Stephen has very much summarized a big event. All this time that they're down there in Egypt and all the problems, because over time a new Pharaoh came along that didn't remember what Joseph had done. And these Israelites over here in the best part of the land, by the way, well, that shouldn't be where they are, right? They're nobodies. They're not Egyptians. They're Israelites, or rather descendants of, they're Hebrews. Descendants of Abraham. So they begin to be oppressed. Even so much so that as they continue to prosper, the Pharaoh decides we got to do something to, eugenics is what you call it. We got to do something to weed this out a little bit. And so we're going to have all the baby boys killed. You know the account. That's when Moses is born. And pointed out in the text here in Stephen's sermon by inspiration, he points out this is when it was getting close to the time that God was going to do this, that he was going to bring them in and give them this land. It's actually 120 years still before they're going to actually get in the land when Moses is born. So we've got this child born, and what's supposed to happen to him? No. What's supposed to happen to him? Pharaoh made a law. Kill him. Kill him. But his parents won't let that happen. It's not the right thing to do, and so they put him in a basket, and he's down in the river, and Pharaoh's daughter, the text just told us, Pharaoh's daughter found him. She named him because of where she found him and what she did with him. And she raised him. And what did he learn? He became mighty in words and deeds among the Egyptians. He learned their culture. He received their education. Is this the law? No. But God's with him all through it, isn't he? I mean, how else do you explain the fact that Moses lives when all those other male children died? How do you explain that? God's with him, right? Do you see a theme developing here from the very beginning? God was with Abraham, he was with Isaac, he was with Jacob, he was with Joseph in Egypt. Now he's with the Israelites all throughout Egypt. Now he's with Moses as he has spent 40 years learning about Egypt and all of that. Is God here? Keep going. But when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For, there's a connecting word, he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. Now, we got a clue there. So Moses was educated by the Egyptians in Egypt as a part of the family of Pharaoh. What would his education have been concerning who the Israelites are or who these descendants of Abraham are? Lesser people. Anything else? What's their role? Slaves. That's it. That's the perspective he's being taught by Pharaoh's house, because that's what Pharaoh believes, right? But somebody else has been teaching him something. His mother actually was in Pharaoh's house when he was young and teaching him too. And over time, by the time he reaches 40 years old, he decides it's time for something. For what? What did his mother teach him? I'm sure she taught him that, yep. He even already had evidence of that. What did he say? We just read that he went out to visit his brethren, and that doesn't mean he went to say hi. That meant he went to check on them for a reason, and he sees an Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian, and then Stephen told us what he was thinking. What was it? What was it? There in verse 25. That they would understand what? That they would understand that he's going to lead them. Now tell me where. Not out. Tell me where to. To the promised land. To the land that Abraham had been promised, Isaac had been promised, Jacob had been promised. God has carried through and carried through. His mother and whoever else is involved has taught him that at some point, the reason God's with you is because he's going to use you to take them back home for the promise. Did they know they were going to end up in Egypt? They should have known. Didn't we just read that when God told Abraham about this, he said, you're not going to get any of it, and I'm going to send your people down to another land, and they're going to oppress you, and then I'm going to bring you out. Didn't he tell Abraham that? Didn't we read? You think they passed that down? But they didn't get it. They did pass it down, but they did not understand. You know they passed it down because Moses knew it. And he had to be taught it by somebody, didn't he? So you know they passed it down, but he understood something that they did not understand. And again, God's dealing with them and blessing them, even not having the law here, not the law of Moses, right? So at 40 years old, he goes out and he tries to lead them out of captivity, and they don't have a clue. They don't have any idea what's going on, and they don't listen to him, and well, let's see what they do. Next day he appeared to two of them as they were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you're brethren, why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? And then at this saying, Moses fled and became a sojourner in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. So he's 40 years old. He says, we're going to make this happen. It's time to lead these people out of captivity, lead them to the land that God had promised, to the inheritance that Abraham had been told about. He goes out, he defends one of them against an Egyptian. How brilliant is that if you are an Egyptian in the ruling class? But he does it because he wants the people to follow him, to lead them to this promised land. And the next day when he goes out to start trying to make this happen, he sees another fight. One of the Hebrews is hurting another Hebrew. He defends the one that's being hurt, and he tries to get them to act like brethren, and the one who's doing wrong accuses him. What's he accusing for? Yeah, he says, I saw it. That's what he says. He says that too. What's the threat here? What's the threat? Huh? I can't hear you. You got to talk louder. Who's going to find out? Not just everybody, but Pharaoh. What is going to happen when one of the leading class kills an Egyptian who was just trying to make sure that his slaves did what he was supposed to do? He's in trouble, isn't he? Yeah, he's in trouble. And so he throws all these accusations out there, but the threat is, I'm going to tell on you. And when I tell on you, you're going to be in trouble. And so Moses, rather than having the confidence that God had taken care of him all of this time and would do it, runs. You know why God doesn't deliver Israel before Moses is born? Wasn't time yet. They weren't ready, right? Why didn't God deliver Israel when Moses is 40 years old and he shows up out there to do the job? Not time yet. Who wasn't ready, though? The people weren't ready, and Moses wasn't ready. It wasn't time. That's right. It's better than he would be later, right? Yeah. The emphasis there is, from my perspective, is, God's timing is always right. My timing's not. I might not like it. I might not think it's the way it ought to happen, but it's still God's timing, right? Okay, but I want to bring up again, even at this point, God is still there, isn't he? Aren't we getting that emphasis in this? Okay, let's keep going. So he's out here in the wilderness now. Verse 30. When 40 years had passed, now how old is he? He's 80, okay. When 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. And when Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. And then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have certainly seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Now stop there a second, because there's been a little bit of an additional clue given us to how these events are coming together. First off, Moses is out here in the wilderness for 40 years, and he is naming his kid a wanderer. He is shepherding for his father-in-law's flock. He is married. He's 80 years old, and he's given up pretty much any hope of ever doing what he grew up believing that God was going to use him to do. Why? It didn't happen the way that he thought it ought to happen. It didn't happen. So the people were not doing, though God was with them, the people had given up, hadn't they? And they were not doing what God wanted. Moses, after it didn't happen the way he thought it was supposed to happen, gave up. He didn't do what God wanted yet. So he's out here in the wilderness 40 years giving up. And in the end of those 40 years, all of a sudden one day, and you know the account, he's on the top of Mount Sinai. He's probably there with his flock. He sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. He goes to see what's happening, and God talks to him. Tells him to take off his shoes because God's there, right? This is the angel of the Lord. That's the pre-incarnate Christ. So he talks to him and says, okay, it's time now. You're going to go back into Egypt, and they didn't want you. They didn't want what I told them, but they will listen now, and I'm going to give you some power, and you're going to be the one to lead them out of Egypt. Now, we know that, he made a lot of excuses, didn't he? Which revealed to us just how far away from what he was, from obeying God he had gone. He'd given up completely of doing what God had chosen him to do, and that happens over the course of time when it doesn't work out, doesn't it? Okay, but he does go. Verse 36. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. Stop there. Another addition comes out about their not being faithful to God. God's still there all along. Moses does go back. He shows all this power that God sent with him. He does lead them out. He takes them across the Red Sea. And then what did it say? How many? 40 years? Is it that long of a walk? It didn't take them that long to get down there, did it? So why did it take them 40 years to get there? Because they didn't do what God asked them to do. God was there all along. They rebelled against him. And in fact, that 40 years is full of it. Over and over. It starts with what happened at Kadesh Barnea with the 12 spies going in and 10 of them came out, or at least that's where the punishment starts to be inflicted upon them. They were complaining and murmuring before that. But they just said, we can't do it. God can't do it. We're just going to go back to Egypt where we were in slavery. That's good enough for us. And so they spent 40 years out here in the wilderness continually just turning away from him. God's still there, isn't he? By the way, at this point, is there a law? Yes. At this point, there is a law, because when they came out of Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai. That's where he gave them the law. Then they went to Kadesh Barnea. Oh, they're always seeing God. Yeah, they're always seeing him. Okay, now let's keep reading. 37. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. And then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets. Did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? Yes, you took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Rephaim, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So, again, a big summary. He brings them out of Egypt. They go to Mount Sinai, and this is where Moses meets with God and comes down to the people and said, here's your God. We'll build a tabernacle. We'll build all these items of worship. God's with us. He is here. And from the very beginning, they kept going from the very beginning of what? Of the law. They kept going with the same pattern. And that is complain, murmur, go back to Egypt, not follow God. Ultimately, they build an idol right there at the base of Mount Sinai when God's given them a law. Does that stop? I mean, when they go 11 days after Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea and they say we can't take this and God sends them back out in the wilderness, did they learn their lesson and quit practicing rebellion against God? When they get up in the land, did they learn their lesson and quit practicing idolatry? No. Wow, I got a long way to go. I'll tell you what, let's just summarize for just a minute because I only got 4 minutes. So starting there in verse 41, he starts talking, or 44, he starts talking again specifically about these people. They had the tabernacle, they rebelled. We built the temple. David wanted to do it, but he couldn't do it. Solomon did it. But we rebelled, and and by the way, we built this temple for God, and yet God said, I'm not going to dwell in a house. The prophecy was about a coming of the Messiah, and God says, I'm not going to be limited to this house. And yet all of your pride is in this house, Stephen says to them. And this is the key. Verse 51. Here's his conclusion. You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. That's very kind, isn't it? It's blunt, because that's all they'll listen to. You always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. What? Isn't that what he just went through in the history? They just kept rejecting. God was always there, and they just kept rejecting him. And he says, you're doing the same thing. God sent you, just like Moses was sent to Israel. God sent you the Messiah, and you're so stubborn and hard-headed that you rejected him. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? Every time God sent them somebody to say, hey, you need to straighten up or you're going into captivity, they said, we're not listening to you. Or they killed them, or they rejected them. They threatened them. And you did the same thing, he said, didn't he? Verse 54. 52 says they killed Jesus. That's Peter's sermon. 54, when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. And that's the exact same cause, and yet the opposite response is what happened on Pentecost. Peter told them, you did it. You killed Jesus, and they were cut to the heart, and they said, how can we fix this? These leaders of the Jews heard Stephen say that, and they were cut to the heart, meaning they recognized they were guilty, and yet instead of repenting, they're going to kill him. In fact, the next thing you read is they take him outside the city and they stone him. And he has such a compassionate heart that he says, he even mentions that he sees Jesus right there as Lord. And then he says, God, do not lay this to their guilt. I'm not sure that I'm there yet. What would cause you to get to a place to where you could say that to the people who are killing you or about them, that you could really, truly pray for somebody who was that kind of enemy? What gets you to that place? I'll give you the name. Jesus. Is that not the same way he acted toward those that were his enemies and sought to kill him? He's trying to follow in the steps of his Lord. Cost him his life. Now, that account is told because, well, if you're here Wednesday night, we'll be introduced to the guy that's standing there making it all happen. We've been talking about him leading up to this already, but we're out of time. Let's close with a prayer. Father, we're so thankful that you provide us with the providential opportunity to be here today to study your word. We're so thankful, Father, that you've left this message to help strengthen our faith, to grow us into the people that honor you in the way that we live, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we interact with our world. Help us to recognize, Father, that without you we are nothing. Help us to depend upon you, know that you are there, and be faithful to you at all times. Forgive us where we fail you. In Christ's name, amen.